afternoon. I'm Sarah Magnoni, and this is the Colorful Living Studio half of ahavafarmcolorfullivingstudio.com. For those of you who do not know, and most of my viewers and subscribers to the Ahava Productions channel probably don't know, I've been a painter for 45 years, and I've taught for 40 years in painting and textiles and mixed media, etc. So the question is, what's the connection? Well, it happens to be snowing today, and there are rainy days, and there are days when you just can't get out to work with the horses for one reason or another. What is the connection between painting and horsemanship? Many, many connections. The number one issue with painting of any kind, whether it is representational, and for those of you who do not know that term, representational means it represents an object, a person, a landscape, animal, etc. Or abstract. And abstract is basically the usage of line, color, texture, in whatever medium you happen to be using to create a separate reality on your picture plane, which in this case is a 36 by 48 canvas. So I'm not going to attempt to finish this canvas today, but what I wanted to explain to my viewers is how do you take that leap when you're looking at this blank space. And even after 45 years of painting, it's actually like jumping off of a bridge. So unlike horsemanship, this is not animate. So I'm really going into this space having complete control. So that's a difference between painting and horsemanship. Horsemanship, you actually don't have complete control because the animal has to cooperate with you. However, the word cooperate is a useful term because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the paint, the Conte crayon, which is what I'm going to use to actually start my drawing. This is Conte crayon, by the way. It is a very compressed drawing tool, which is actually quite precise. So unlike charcoal, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't smudge. It's kind of a nice drawing tool. You can blend it, which I will show you in a minute. But it's a nice way to start on a canvas. It's a little bit easier to use than pencil. So why abstraction? That's an interesting question. When I woke up this morning, what came into my mind, and this is what I'm going to ask art students to do, and if you are an art student, I'm glad you're here and I'm glad you're watching. I want you to go with your gut. Do not allow outside interference into that decision. And that decision is, what am I going to do with this blank space? My gut this morning was yellow, horizontal, which is called landscape style as opposed to vertical, and abstract. Where does the abstract come from? Originally, the Cubists, that's Picasso and Braque, the Russian and German abstract artists, the Kandinskys and the Paul Klays, started out doing representational work. They all did classical drawing, and they got bored with the restrictions of representational work. They were brilliant draftspeople, so do not ever think that an abstraction doesn't involve drawing. It does. If you don't know where to put the mark on the canvas, your abstraction is going to be just kind of blobby, but it's not going to make any sense. So how do you impose structure on something that is completely abstract? There are a couple of rules, again, similar to horsemanship, that you always follow. And that is, number one, you are going to use a color in more than one place on this picture plane. not just in one place. There are very, very few artists, even abstract artists in the history of modern art in particular, who ever got away with just having color in one area on the canvas. So you're going to use that color at least twice, preferably 3 times, and that's the trinity that creates harmony in the composition. No matter what the composition is, you're going to use that color 2 or 3 times, okay? That's number 1. Number 2, the best way to start an abstraction, in my experience, is actually to draw. And I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to use, this is actually a charcoal pencil, and what I'm going to do is just kind of go with my gut. So I'm actually going to draw shapes. I'm going to put in something that is typical in a landscape, which is a horizon line. And I'm going to make that horizon line right about here. You never ever do the horizon line in the middle of the canvas. And as my filmmaker has pointed out to me, we've had this discussion before, great filmmakers like John Ford will tell you the same thing. Don't split your frame completely in half. You want to go down here or up here so that you have actually an uneven space on the top and the bottom, and it's much more visually interesting. So I'm going to start drawing, and when I have finished and am happy with my base drawing, we're going to go over how to start thinking about applying color and how to use the paint. By the way, I'm using acrylic paint, which is water-based. It was invented in, maybe the late 30s, early 40s, when it became very clear that acrylic polymers were going to be the basis of just about everything, including tires and all kinds of military equipment, etc. So just about at that time, acrylic paint began to be used instead of oil paint. Now, many people use oil paint. The difference is that acrylic is water-based, like watercolor. Oil paint is oil-based and it is translucent. Acrylic is opaque. So let me get started. And I'm going to split this canvas right about here. I'm doing almost what I would call stream of consciousness drawing. Okay, so I've got some base line, and then I'm going to fill in my composition. My inspiration for at least 35 years is the great abstract artists like Miro, and as I said, Kandinsky. And in many cases, Miro and Kandinsky, before going totally into abstraction, started out abstracting still life and figures in compositions that bordered on surrealism, or actually were surrealism. I'm not going to go that route today. When you're doing this kind of drawing, just keep going. Don't interrupt yourself until you feel you have something that is a good base to work with. Now, when you start painting, you are not necessarily going to stick with this exact format. As you use the paint, it will begin to take on a life of its own. So I've done, I believe, what I think is a good start. And now we're going to talk about paint. So I'm starting with these rather small tubes, and of course to finish this painting I will have to kind of progress to larger tubes because I like very, very thick paint. To use acrylic paint, You're obviously going to need a palette. This is a disposable palette. You can buy them on Amazon. You can get them literally anywhere. ASW, Dick Blick, Art Supplies, they're all over the place. The reason to use the disposable palette rather than a plastic palette is acrylic dries very fast. When you're done painting for the day, you can cover it with silver foil or some kind of saran wrap or whatever, but I have never found that that was particularly successful. You can literally roll it up and throw it away. All right, and you need a palette knife. So what I'm going to do right now is a basic primer on mixing color. Now, when you're mixing color, you are taking a base color, and let's say you're going light, you're adding white to it. If you're going darker, you're adding black. Now, the thing to remember about that is adding black goes very dark very fast. So do this in small increments, and in fact, you might want to practice by creating a palette with the kinds of colors you want to use in your painting beforehand and just mixing first. Now, another fantastic aid in mixing color, and I learned to do this at Connecticut College in the art department, which was taught by a whole bunch of really wonderful professors who all had studied with Joseph Albers at Yale. Joseph Albers created the idea of color aid paper. This is spectacular paper. It is the purest color you can find to match your mixed color to. So a lot of beginning painters in particular have difficulty creating a broad range of color. Go to Amazon, buy a package of color aid paper, and use it as your matching base to match your color to the paper. The paper is screen printed, so the color is absolutely pure. And it's extremely useful if you're having problems saying, okay, how am I going to get this line between the orange and the blue to pop? Try matching it up with the color aid paper. Okay, I'm going to put it over here, and let's talk about mixing some color. So I said, I think at the beginning, that I wanted to start with some yellow. So I've got several yellows here. I have, let's put on my glasses so I can see what I'm doing. We have an ochre, we have a gold, we have a lemon yellow, we have just a sort of generic yellow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take these yellows and come up with some base color that I feel is emotionally right for me right now. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically get all of this yellow out. That's a lot of paint, by the way, so be prepared. I want you to use a lot of paint. I know it seems as though that's wasteful, but it's not. Okay, so that's a slightly different shade of yellow. There are all kinds of yellows available. Cadmium yellows, ochres, etc. Okay, let's take this, which is a Naples yellow, and I'm going to grab some paper towels. Always, always have paper towels available, both for your hands and for the palette knife, and water right there. Okay, your brushes are going to go into water 100% of the time. This is a Liquitex Basics acrylic. It's called Parchment. What it is titanium white. And what it does, if I can get this out, yep, there we go, is it allows me to blend these yellows with the palette knife and gain body. Yellow tends to be extremely translucent. when using it on a canvas. So anything you can do to toughen up the body of that paint before actually applying it to a canvas is going to be useful. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use what's known as a flat brush. It's kind of a rectangular brush. These are nylon, so they are usable both for watercolor and acrylic. I'm not putting this in water, all right? I'm using the paint just flat. And I'm not worried about any bleeding of that Conte crayon line. To me, that adds body to the yellow. And I'm using this very, very heavily. And I'll show you how we progress both within this little area to add contrast. Now, when I say contrast, remember, we're talking about an abstraction here. So the question is there light and dark in an abstraction? Is there the ability to create foreground and background? And the answer to that is yes. So let's take this, which is burnt sienna, and let's see what happens here. So what's happened, adding the burnt sienna, is that I've created a really nice sense of something that has a painterly, what's known as a painterly quality. In other words, it's not screen printed. It has a foreground, it has a background, and let's actually put some light and dark into this square. So this is white, and let's say I want this top area from the rest of this shape. So now we've got light, darker, and the base yellow. Okay, let's go back to what I first said. How are we going to make sure that this composition is balanced? We're going to use the yellow in at least 3 places. Okay, so let's come up here. Once you establish those 3 places, then you can build other color into the composition. But this is how I work. I always start by going for harmony. And remember, the harmony, I'm going to repeat it again, is kind of the trinity, which is use the same color or a range of colors, shades that are close to that color in 3 places on the canvas. I'm going to do the same thing with the burnt umber, and then I'm going to make the top. I'm not going to blend that white. I'm going to let it just be thick. I think I'm going to come over here, use the yellow over here. And obviously I'm going to use it in more than 3 places, but it's a good start. I know if I've used the color 3 times that this composition is going to be harmonious. And this time I'm going to use the white right away and actually go directly onto the canvas there with no mixing with the yellow, just because it's a different way of using that color. The other great thing about the variety of brushes that are available to artists, and again, these are flats, this is a round, this is a fan brush, which is incredibly useful. You will love using fan brushes. They're really a lot of fun. Is that you can get all kinds of different texture using different kinds of brushes. And the brush does the work for you. Kind of the way rope halters do the work for you in horsemanship. Knowing how to use the tools is very, very important. There's a reason for flat brushes. There's a reason for round brushes. There's a reason for detail brushes, which are very, very small. Now let's say I want to really extend the use of this yellow that I've mixed. Because remember, I said earlier on, acrylic dries very, very fast. So there is something called a retarding medium that slows the drying time, but I do not tend to use it. First of all, I work very fast, but the second issue is I find that the retarding medium so changes the quality of the paint and the dispersibility of the paint that it doesn't have a good feeling to me. But you can use it. So Liquitex makes a good retarding medium. Golden Acrylics makes a good retarding medium. And you can try them. And that's what I would recommend that you do is A, try different brands. I do not hesitate to mix brands. I have no particular favorite. So what I want everybody to see is that although the base here is yellow, each one of these little areas that I've painted actually looks rather different, okay? And that's really about, I'm gonna put this in water and we're gonna start using a different color. Okay, so what would I use next? Next to the yellow to establish really strong and bright contrast. There is a whole theory of color. I talked about Joseph Albers, who was the absolute grandfather of color theory in the 20th century. The theory is that complementary colors create a literal visual vibration between each other when you place them next to each other. So next to a yellow, I have two really good choices, purple or violet and blue. Now to see absolutely spectacular color vibration, please look at Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, who was known as a fauve, F-A-U-V-E-S, which basically translates into wild ones, which is how the French school of painting considered Gauguin and also Van Gogh. They were crazy. They were really just out of the mainstream, but their color was absolutely revolutionary and it changed the course of contemporary painting. So if you look at a Gauguin, you will see a purple sky and a yellow landscape, not a green landscape. There would be a line of yellow right next to that purple sky, and it just glows. So, coming back from Gauguin, let's try violet or purple and see how that works. And we'll experiment. So it doesn't have to be absolutely correct the first time around. The great thing about acrylic, and something that's a little bit more difficult with oil because it's translucent, is that acrylic is completely opaque. So when it dries, you can paint right over it and you see nothing of the color that's underneath. This can be very, very useful if you feel that you've made a mistake and you want to change the color or the design, etc. So let's see what we come up with here. And I think I may need to go to an actual dioxazine purple, but this is not a bad start. I'm going to clean off my palette knife. Dioxazine purple, by the way, is a base color. So usually in most beginning paint sets, it comes pre-mixed. This is more of a lavender, but it will do. Oh, there we go. So let's see how this does next to the yellow. I have a feeling this will be exactly right. Yeah. Perfect. Yep. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to set up some white to give myself some options of going lighter. The other nice thing about flat brushes is that it's very, very easy to create straight lines. Again, the brush does the work. So if you use it properly, it will both spread the paint without your doing a tremendous amount of work to get that done, and it will create a nice, crisp, sharp line. So I'm going to lighten the interior and just leave that way for now. And let's use our 3 rule. And then I'm going to add some other purple areas as well. Now again, this is a big painting. This is 36 by 48. So there will be more yellow, and there will probably be what I would call more lemon yellow as I move on. But this is actually a really good way to work, as I said, kind of stream of consciousness, to work sort of from the inside of the composition out, doing an abstraction, where basically you are making all of the color choices. You're not controlled by what exists in nature. You're not controlled by a photograph or a predetermined image. And actually, this is a great thing to do for beginning colorists in particular, because it really tests your ability to create an interesting image from your head, from your gut. And it's very zen, very, very mindful.
Particularly like that part of the painting, because it's the sun and the moon, it looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we already have an interpretation. That's what's great about this. You're really allowing that first gut reaction I had this morning of, I think, yellow and horizontal, to in fact control meaning. You're achieving meaning in the moment. So I have 4 areas of purple. I'm going to go to this circle here, and I'm going to use it here, and then I'm going to add some other color to that as well. So what I'm doing, as I said, is I'm building this from the inside out, and I'm going to allow what happens as I work to control what will happen with the background. In other words, I'm not actually making decisions about the background in advance. That can feel a little scary for people, but the way to handle that is to always use color theory and your basic knowledge of how to create harmony. And again, we go back to, we're not going to use a color only in one place. Dark colors recede, light colors come forward. So because you don't have the burden in a painting like this of actual representation, you're really allowing the color to tell the story, which is a lot of fun. And it requires some discipline too. So I'm going to come down here because this feels right to me, right here. So I'm using a lot of white in this particular triangle to get a different feeling to the purple, which has now become more of a lavender. Make that a little darker. So I think I'm going to come in here because this also feels right. There is a certain element to this kind of painting that is, I would have to admit, it's just plain experience. But the most important thing for people who are just starting out is don't stop. Keep going. If you think you need to go darker, go really darker. If you think you need to go lighter, go really light. I would say the main mistake that most beginning painters make is they don't use enough contrast because they're kind of afraid to get really, really strong. Well, right now, we're going to do something that's a little risky in traditional classical painting. We're going to use black. Now, black is very common in 20th century abstraction. People used black a lot to create definition and line, etc. It is not so common in more traditional painting, and it's not that common in oil painting. I'm going to use it because I love black, and I think it's really, really interesting to use, especially in abstraction. Now, what I may do with the black, and because this is an abstraction, I can use it actually exactly the way it is, I will probably add some white to it, which of course will make it gray. So I'm not going to use it next to the purple, okay? I'm going to create kind of new areas which are black, and I'll show you how we make gray. Yeah, I'm not basically a sitting person. I really like to stand most of the time, no matter what I'm doing. Okay, so let's come over here, and then I'm going to do some black areas that become gray because it's so beautiful to look at and to watch that paint become something else. And again, becoming gray adds almost a foreground and a background to the black areas. So let's do this. Remember, as I'm working, if something doesn't suit me, it can be changed. So allow yourself to just go. And there we go into a gray. It's another great exercise for people who are just starting or people who are not just starting, is to actually do a gray tone exercise on a palette. So start out with black and just add minute quantities of white over and over and over again, and see if you can go from black to white on one palette. It's quite a challenge. Doesn't sound like a challenge, but it is. Now, one question that you might have is what happens when I finish all of these blank areas, and there actually may be some areas on this canvas that I decide to leave white. Sometimes the mark of a great composition is what you leave out. But let's say I get everything colored and I'm still not satisfied. It's not popping to me. At that point, black becomes very useful because I can add more line. I can add more line with, I'm thinking, red. Your composition does not have to be set in stone. It doesn't have to be finished in one sitting, and obviously this painting is not going to be finished in one sitting. My recommendation is, particularly if you're working on in a larger format, is get as much done as you feel comfortable with in one sitting, and then leave it for 24 hours and come back and see how you feel about it. And I also have another recommendation. As much as I love to drink wine, it doesn't necessarily improve one's painting. In fact, all of this nonsense about the crazy artist is actually not really true, because most artists do their most lucid and their best work absolutely stone sober. So accessing that creativity is not necessarily enhanced by alcohol, just something to keep in mind. Okay, now what I've done here is I've gotten some of this very beautiful violet, and I'm putting some of this parchment. So we've got a kind of combination there, which is also useful in establishing a connection with the other areas that are purple. Don't be afraid either to get messy or to throw some paint out. You don't have to save every drop. If you feel as though your mind is going to work better visually by getting rid of the palette and starting over, get rid of the palette and start over. Don't force yourself to stay there. Stand back from your work, guys. I know you have probably seen those very funny pictures of artists squinting and this, that, and the other thing. Now, the reason they're squinting, by the way, when they're looking at their paintings, and this is actually the source of Impressionism, by the way, the reason they're squinting is that is sometimes the best way to see how successful your contrast is. And when I say contrast, I'm not only talking about the shifting between colors. I'm talking about light and dark. And when I think you can see already there is a sense of movement in this composition that is created by not only by the drawing, but by the addition of the really dark black. So that's what I was talking about when I said before, do not be afraid to go really dark and really light. And as I said, there may be areas of this canvas that I decide to leave just with no color at all. I'm using my same rules. This is not going to be used only once. It will be used more than once, probably 3 or 4 times, or some version thereof. In other words, I can take this red, add some black to it, and go much darker with it, which I think I will probably do because it's actually a fairly light red. It's a red hue is what that's called. And a hue is simply a base color, like red, to which either black or white has been added to form a version of that base color. What's happening here, which I like, is that the Conte crayon is actually bleeding into the red, and I'm just leaving that. And I'm definitely going to add some white, I believe, to these red areas, because it's actually a little flat for me. So if I were to choose what to put next to the red, I'd go back to my basic complementary colors and go with green. I think the best way to look at painting is, and there's a term in the art world, and it's called making a painting. People don't really think of making art, but that's what it is. You're basically building something. It's a construction project. Best story I ever heard about what that actually means was told to me by an art history professor my freshman year at Connecticut College. And his name was Richard Arms, and he was a really funny guy, absolutely brilliant art historian. And he had this class full of 150 freshmen. And he gave us, I believe, a painting by Caravaggio to evaluate. and tell the story of. So it was a Renaissance painting, and everybody did these really long, absolutely wonderful compositions about the symbolism and death and rebirth and all of these great, great terms. And Richard Arms got all these papers and he tore them all up and he threw them out and he said, okay guys, now we're really going to talk about what this painting looks like. So what he said, I've never forgotten, and it goes like this. He said, imagine that you have a painting that's just been stolen and you have a young police officer just graduated from the police academy who comes to your house and says, ma'am, can you describe this painting to me? I know it was stolen. And you're not going to say to that police officer, it's about death and it's about rebirth and there's all kinds of symbolism. And the police officers go, yeah, ma'am, but what does it actually look like? What you're going to say is there's a blob of red over here and a blob of blue over here, and there's a table in the middle and a whole bunch of people sitting around it, etc. What he meant was a painting, no matter what your original idea is, to an artist is a construction project. And when you're tempted to look at a painting saying, well, I know what that purple means. It means moonlight. It means this. It means that. And the artist will look at you and say, actually, I just ran out of blue. So just keep that in mind. And my point here is anybody can paint. Don't let anybody tell you you can't paint because you don't know how to draw and you can only draw stick figures, etc. If you can pick up this brush and put it into the paint, use the palette knife and do some mixing and play with the medium, you can paint. Everybody can. So, okay, let's get back to our work here. I'm going to do a little more with this red, and then I'm going to talk briefly about our new feature on our website, which is Art in Support of Animals. So, because I have been a painter for 45 years and I have a lot of work in the house and in my sheds, I am offering it to our viewers and subscribers in print and mounted canvas print form. And that will be available on the website within a week, 2 weeks. And it's called Art in Support of Animals. I will put in the description box a direct link. And if you are interested both in the painting itself, just for the sake of art, or if you are interested in supporting the herd by buying art, it will be available shortly, and I must have probably 75 paintings in the house that I think would be appropriate for people to buy. So that will be available, as I say, within a week or so. And let's get back to my work. Oh, and please like, please comment, and subscribe. And feel free to say anything you want to say about my painting. I will not be hurt or upset. Let us know what your experience in painting is. Do you use acrylics? Do you use oils? Have you never done this before? I also wanted to say, for those who don't have access to art training, or who just have never experienced it for one reason or another, what I am painting on, I did say this was a 36 by 48 pre-stretched canvas, but it's also got something called gallery wrapping. So the canvas is actually wrapped around the stretcher bars and it's stapled in the back. So this painting does not have to be framed. If I paint the sides of this canvas, which I will, it can be hung exactly the way it is. Doesn't need framing. It's my preferred way to work. I like the thick stretcher bars. And it's very common in contemporary painting not to frame. There's kind of a cleaner look not framing. Okay, so we did some of this kind of punchy, peachy red color. And as promised, I am going to go next to that red with green. Green is a complementary color to the red. And I started out with a phthalocyanine green, which tends to be very translucent. So I added other greens to it in order to get more bulk to the paint. In this case, I'm using the flat brush and the slight translucence to actually create texture by using the brush a little differently. And that's another thing you can do. Watercolorists are very accustomed to doing that. As you can see, I'm using the brush and the translucence to create some texture. To find more information on the use of color, I would definitely recommend that people look up Joseph Albers, Joseph Albers, and find the book, again, it's available on Amazon, called Interaction of Color. Very interesting book, and he actually created, as I said earlier, the concept of color aid papers so that artists could get very, very precise about what color was doing to their paintings and how to use it more effectively. All right, now we've got a green area which is bordering both the red and the purple. So what I'm going to do to make this a little more interesting, because these two colors, the green and the purple, are actually of similar value. And when I use the word value, what that means is they're the same level of darkness or lightness. So in order to make that contrast a little better, I'm going to add some white to the green once I finish this. So you can see, because they are the same level of light and dark, it's not as easy to differentiate between the purple and the green. So to solve that problem, I'm really going to lighten the area that borders the purple without affecting the red border, which is very, very clear. I'm going to add some white here. I think the issue with the color is what actually makes the contrast, and that's why I told that Richard Arms story, which is it's a construction, and each element of constructing has a purpose. It's not just random. Even though it may seem random because it's an abstraction, it's actually not. What I am feeling right now is we need some blue, but it's got to be light blue. And this is something that I want everybody to get accustomed to doing. Using the word feeling. How do you feel about it? Where do you feel this color should be going? So I'm feeling right now, John raised a very interesting issue of getting back to the yellow, which we will, but right now I'm going to go into some blue, and then we need a lot of white. This is kind of a teal and aqua. And I'm going to make this quite light. And let's see how this goes. So I've mixed quite a bit of paint here. And I'm actually going to use some more white. If you remember, earlier on, I said that the yellow base, actually I can go over that line, can contrast just as easily with blue as it contrasts with violet. So they are equal in their complementary character to each other in terms of contrasting with the yellow. So when we get back to the yellow, the blue will be just as useful as the violet. One of the things I'm doing here, I don't know whether it's clearly visible, but I'm kind of building out from the center. And that's a good rule of thumb to use. Instead of focusing on the edges or the perimeters, build from the center. It is a very windy day. I hear that wind rattling outside. So as John says, it's a good day to be indoors and not a particularly comfortable day to be working with the horses, who don't tend to enjoy heavy wind. Here. So, I think we're going to stop there for a little while. I am very happy with where this is going, really happy with where it's going. I will bring back more yellow into the composition, but I'm going to let this dry. And as I mentioned before, one of the good things to do when you've been working very energetically for an hour or so is just to take a step back. Come back to it a little later and start fresh. But I'm happy with where this is going, partly because I like the contrast between the more textured areas of color and the flatter areas of color. I think that works really well for this painting. So once again, we're talking about abstraction, that is basically a stream of consciousness drawing, or automatic drawing is how it's described in some circles to start out with. Working from the inside of the composition out when you're starting a painting like this, and starting with a color that just comes into your head, and then working from there, building the composition by starting with a base color and then working out from there. So the next episode, I'm sure this will be finished, or it might be finished beforehand, and we can talk about how I brought it to completion. And once again, please like, comment, and subscribe. It's Ahava Farm Colorful Living Studio, and this is the Colorful Living Studio part. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again in the next episode.